This panel was recorded January 29th, 2021, during the 13th Annual Human Trafficking Awareness Day event and film festival. This panel, moderated by Bishop Kelvin Cabarrus of Impact Church, is titled Power of Faith-Based Communities, Why You Should Care.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel forum here at the 13th Annual Human Trafficking Awareness Day and Film Festival. We are excited that each of you are joining us here live and those who are joining us virtually for this most power-packed, interesting discussion that I believe that by the end of this discussion, if there are those who are not aligned with being a part of the assignment of abolishing this particular ideal of human trafficking, if they're not involved after they hear what they hear today and the stories and the testimonies and the compassion of our faith leaders and their work around this particular topic and service, that they will be motivated and driven to join in and be a part of abolishing this entirety throughout our nation and world. My name is Bishop Kelvin L. Cabarrus. I am the pastor of the Everlasting Life Church of Eustis, Florida, and I am the founder of Cabarrus Ministries International, and I am a native of Orlando, Florida. I've been in ministry for 36 years, and out of those 36 years, 22 of those years I've spent serving as a pastor and, of course, international evangelist that has the opportunity to travel all around the globe propagating the gospel of Christ, and not only that, but serving and meeting social and human needs in various countries like India, Africa, and so on. So today I come with a host of experience and knowledge and understanding of what it means to stand in support, to stand and advocate, to stand as a lead, to help restore and to build. But I know what it also means to be an activist, to stand against things that are of injustice and things of that sort, because that is our work in our local community, to work to meet the needs of communities that are maligned and underserved, to make sure that proper attention gets to those communities and that all of us experience the equality and equity that God has so ordained under this great nation that we live in. So today, as we gather for this particular panel, I want to first give recognition to our sponsors, and that's First Presbyterian Church, where Dr. Swanson, one of our panelists today, serves as the senior pastor, and we want to thank them for sponsoring our panel today and all that they do around the subject of human trafficking. Thank you, Dr. Swanson. As I begin to think about human trafficking and this word, I could not help but to juxtapose it to the reality of what the people that I'm a part of and the culture that I was born in have had to go through for some time. Just some 400 years ago, when slavery was okay and it was legalized, where human beings such as African Americans were under the strong arm of slave masters, and it was supported by the law at that time, where humans were treated with no decency, were treated with no dignity, and were treated as if they had no rights because they were just property and somebody's possession. And then as we come 400 years later, while laws have changed and while civil rights exist and while there are many great things that have been put in place, as you can see just recently in what has happened in our culture today, that we still have some realities of modern day slavery and those who want to go back to the things of the past of putting people under suppression and control and treating them less than human. As I begin to think about that experience and think about my own forefathers and think about my grandparents and my parents and my elders, and even thinking about what I have experienced in my lifetime, I could not help but to begin to look at how that relates to those who have been victims of human trafficking. At the end of the day, whether human trafficking was done through the slavery of the past, where it was legalized, whether the modern day human trafficking or what takes place today, where people are being victimized all over our country, and some don't even realize right here locally in our city. At the end of the day, it is an injustice. And the Bible tells us in Micah 6:8, he has showed the old man what is good and what the Lord requires of us, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And so today, as faith leaders are gathering with our minds and our hearts and our hands around this particular issue, today you're going to hear from a quorum of clergy and faith-based leaders who I believe are some of the most skilled and most credible minds around this topic, not just because they're educated, but because their heart is involved in it. And where their heart is involved in it, their hands are involved. And where their hands are involved, they have brought their organization and the entities that they influence around this ideal of human trafficking and abolishing it by putting their hands to the plow, putting their hearts around those who've been victimized, and making sure that we can use all of our resources and all that God has permitted to us to help make a difference and to help bring an end to human trafficking and to help be a part of the healing process of those who've been impacted by it. With that being said, I want to introduce our panelists today. And as I said, we have a great quorum of panelists who are well-respected voices within our community, and I would like to introduce them. The first person that I will introduce today is Dr. David Swanson, who is the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Orlando. Will you welcome Dr. Swanson? Then we'll introduce Dee Coleman of Samaritan Village. Would you welcome Dee? Then finally, we'll introduce Dr. Anthony Davis of No Limits Ministries. Would you welcome Dr. Davis? We're grateful for these individuals who took their time out today to be a part of this panel. And I believe that as we pose questions today and take questions from the virtual community and from the audience that are around this topic, that all of us will leave here with more knowledge than we came in with and empowered to go back and to continue to serve in this fight against human trafficking. The intention of this panel today, as this panel is entitled, The Power of Faith-Based Communities, Why You Should Care. Well, when it comes to the ideal of faith-based communities, why we should care is all in our name. We're a faith-based community. And if anybody should give a care around the subject matter of protecting and healing human beings, it should be the church or the community of faith. So today, as we begin to have this discussion around why we care, you will learn of different ideals and resources and services that these various organizations are engaging in to help toward the abolishing of human trafficking. And then you will learn some different things that they're pondering over and different ideals that they're stretching their imaginations so that they can continue to expand this work and encourage other clergy and other faith-based organizations to get engaged and involved. With that being said, we want to jump right into our questions for today, and just give me just a moment. Had it all together there. All right. The first question, well, first of all, before I get into questions, let me back up. I'm moving a little too fast. I introduce our panelists, and I said their name, but I'm going to go through them one by one and allow them just to give a little bit more information about themselves outside of the organization that they represent. And they're going to share with us the organization that they represent, some information about themselves. And then what we want to hear from each one of them is to share about when you first heard about human trafficking and the impact that it had on you personally. We want to know the personal impact that this whole subject matter of human trafficking started with. Dr. Swanson.
Yeah. Well, I'm David Swanson. I've been here in Orlando for 17 years as the senior pastor at First Pres downtown. And it has often been said of downtown churches that when you're in the middle of a city center, then all the problems that we tend to face culturally and socially are going to be right at your doorstep. Everything that could happen in a culture, society is going to be happening in that downtown area. You get a taste of everything. And so I quickly learned that there were many, many needs that were being unmet. There were many social issues that our community was struggling with. And so I started to try to involve myself and as Bishop said, get my hands dirty. And the primary place where I was working for a number of years was in the area of homelessness. And the homeless problem, the homeless brothers and sisters that we have, that just continues to proliferate, but we've made great progress in that. But as I was engaged in that, I discovered this was in 2010. And that was my first, what I would call the first realization. And that was the last time the Super Bowl was in Miami. And I don't remember who played in the game, but I remember there was a news story that was done that talked about the vast increase in the numbers of people being arrested and the number of men who were coming to Miami for the sole purpose of finding escorts, prostitutes, those who would be caught in this trap of human trafficking. And then, and Dee may know the statistics better than I did, but if I'm not mistaken, Central Florida was the number 3 area for calls for help in regard to trafficking. And so here I am, I'm the pastor of a downtown church. We're pretty active in the community. And that's the first time I'd ever heard that. And I'm like, wait, how did this get past me? And how do I become involved in this? And that's when I reached out to Tomas at the time, what was Florida Abolitionists, and then Rhonda Hauser at Samaritan Village, and that's now being led by Dee. And so it's interesting as a church because it's not the same thing as working with somebody who's homeless, where there are kind of, what solves homelessness is homes and transportation and jobs and things like that. Human trafficking is so much more insidious, and it's so much more challenging to put your arms around and to try to do something as a faith community that actually makes a difference, because so many of these things, you want to be protecting the privacy and the confidentiality of the women who are being rescued. So you're not going to have immediate access necessarily to them. And so there are just a number of ways that you have to creatively engage as a faith community. And we very much believe as a church in the principle of social justice, that as a faith community, what is social justice? Social justice is the restoration of the right order of things. That if God is an ordered God, not a chaotic God, if he has ordered our communities in a particular way for righteousness and for justice, when we find they have become disordered by the sin which entangles us, then our role as Christian men and women is to try to reorder and restore the right order of God's intended purpose and plan for communities and cultures. And so we, as our membership, we have tried to be faithful to that and to stand and advocate with and for others, especially women who are caught in this terrible web of pain and deceit and slavery. So that's kind of a little bit about what what we are doing presently, and my first exposure to that. I'm married, been married for 32 years and have 3 children. But my youngest is a girl, a daughter who is 25, and she lives in Nashville. And I think without question, that also impacted when I heard this was going on, and I started imagining the parents of these young women. That was deeply painful to me, thinking about my own child. And so it was a place where we could do nothing but act and engage. And so that's a little bit about my experience.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
It's not on. It's flashing red. Push it. There you go. Now you're on.
Can you guys hear me? Hi, everybody. My name is Dee Coleman, and I am the executive director of Samaritan Village. Samaritan Village is a safe house. We have a safe house here in Orlando, Florida, with our main mission to provide a safe place for women that have been sexually trafficked and exploited to find safety, healing, and return to wholeness. Ultimately finding their restoration in Jesus Christ. And so I learned about human trafficking many years ago when I was still in college. I was an undergrad in the early 2000s, and I was actually sitting in my home church in Los Angeles, and a pastor had come, and she was talking about this horrific situation that was happening in Greece and overseas. And she was at the time just launching an organization that was going to go and rescue these women and children that were being held captive. And I remember sitting there with goosebumps up my arm thinking, oh my gosh, this is why I was created. This is the work that I feel like God has called me to. And so I went back to school that semester and changed my major to international relations and thought, one day I'm going to travel across the world and go save these women and children. Well, fast forward, my life took many different turns, and I ended up working in nonprofits, but not anywhere near anything in human trafficking. And in fact, I'd actually forgotten about it. At the time, I did a little bit of volunteer work, but if you can think back to where we were almost 20 years ago, there wasn't Google. So I couldn't go home that day after church and Google, what is human trafficking, or find opportunities to serve. It was like whatever my church provided at that very moment, that was it. So my life went on, and anytime I would hear the phrase human trafficking or hear of a story, my heart would just ache, and then I'd kind of move on. When I moved here to Florida, I began to work for a foundation that actually is in the same church as Heart of the City as First Pres, Heart of the City Foundation. And we had provided a grant to Samaritan Village. And I remember looking up the organization and going, oh my gosh, wow, there's an organization here in Orlando that is helping women that have been rescued from human trafficking. I wonder what country they're from. I wonder where these international women are coming from, even in my own ignorance. And as I did more digging and finding out, like, these are our sisters, our brothers, our American cousins, and they are born and bred, many of the women at Samaritan Village right here in the state of Florida, and are being exploited. And so, to be honest, it feels like I landed at Samaritan Village like a calling. That prayer that I had prayed sitting in church as a teenager, saying, Lord, that's what I want to do with my life. And it was like he just ordered my steps, not knowing that one day I would be at Samaritan Village serving women here in my home nation for the very issue that just had pulled at my heart many, many years ago. And I often say that I know when I started working with the ladies, God gave me this image of how he had just kind of spoke to my spirit and kind of said, even the dreams and desires that you had all those years ago, I have the ability to resurrect them. I have the ability to make them new again. You had forgotten about it, but I did not. And so I often feel that parallel with the ladies, as they've often forgotten about their own dignity and worth and who they were created to be. I get the great privilege of walking alongside them as they rediscover that. And God says, I didn't forget them.
Well, thank you. My name is Dr. Anthony Davis, and this is interesting. For me, I came to Orlando in '99 to start a ministry, and in 2000 we started in a little storefront on East Colonial. And initially, I began my work there dealing with the folks that are on the street, because I dealt a lot with gang members and folks of that nature coming from a law enforcement background. I used to be a federal agent with the Air Force. And I used to be a pharmaceutical representative for Merck. And, you do all these different things. You never think they're going to come together to serve one purpose. But I started early on in our ministry working with domestic violence, working against abuse of women. And, God placed it on my heart really to work with that, because as a child, I remember, a volatile situation in my family early on. And I just remembered that as a kid. And so I began working with the Orange County Domestic Violence Task Force, where I eventually became the chair for 5 years. And then I met I met a lady that worked at the Harbor House, Carol Wick. She had just taken over, and I had just had one of my members who was shot and killed by her husband. And so in theology and learning in all the schools that I've been to, there's no discussions or chapters on dealing with domestic violence. And so I was thrust into it. And having had a member that was shot and killed, and then working with Carol Wick and saying, what can I do about this? And I remember going through the training at Harbor House and spending time and going and picking up the women from the Harbor House. I was one of the only males that was on the campus at that time, and bringing them back to church and really trying to understand the things that they were going through. And it was shortly after that, probably around 2009 or 10, that, I met a gentleman named Tomas Laris, and we had lunch. And he began telling me this thing about human trafficking. And we began to discuss the correlation between domestic violence and human trafficking, where you're talking about an intrafamilial situation with a husband and a wife or boyfriend, but at the same time, you're talking about a pimp or daddy and his girls, the same type of interpersonal relationships exist there. And I began to look at the correlation, and slowly God began to gravitate me from dealing with domestic violence, but taking the information from that whole power and control issue and looking at how it affected human trafficking, the fact that people were being taken not only for sex trafficking, but for labor and otherwise, and basically essentially making them slaves. And that whole power and control dynamic that was there. And shortly after working with Thomas, I became the board chair for Florida Abolitionists and spent the next 10 years working with Thomas, bringing it up from a little fledgling organization that was doing the best it could to where it was working with the local police department and the federal agencies to really establish, a number of cases and things that are going on. And now I've had the opportunity to work still at United Abolitionists. I'm the national trainer and ambassador, and our goal now is to really get out and to take this message to clergy and corporations and businesses across this nation and establish a network, establish a collaborative effort, understanding the relationship between Christian-based, faith-based organization, churches, and law enforcement and other NGOs, so how they can work together as a collaborative effort, and also to really train ministries as how to get out there and truly evangelize with traffickers. Because our status has always been, we tell people, if you love God, he'll take you from this and you don't have to be out there anymore. And I learned very quickly when I used to go to the jail and talk to the young inmates, their soul, it was their soul that was more important. I didn't need the Bible because the love of God was inside me. And God quickly showed me that you show the love, you look in their eyes and you see their hearts. And I saw that. I've talked to probably hundreds of women who have been victims of human trafficking. And you alluded to that, the fact that there's a little girl that's in there that never asked for any of this. And that little girl has been through a lot of years of trauma, whether it's from her family, whether she was sold from others or whatever, through self-esteem or low self-esteem. She still wanted to get out. She still wanted to be heard. And trying to bring that whole understanding as to what was needed in dealing with human trafficking and what we can do. And it's been my pleasure over the last 10 plus years to work with Thomas and to work with the different task force that are out there and to have trained and talked to so many hundreds and thousands of people on what they can do to really deal with this epidemic that is not a third world issue like we all thought, but right here in our own backyard, both on the demand and the sales side.
Thank you. Great responses. And as we just kind of expound upon this and build upon this more, I guess the next question leads to how your church ministry or organization has become involved in the movement. Kind of just share exactly what you're doing, how you're engaging this whole movement. We'll start with UD and then we'll go to Dr. Swanson. Dr.
I'm going to take off my mask this time so you guys can hear me. So Samaritan Village was founded by a chaplain who was working in the 33rd Street in Orange County Jail, and also had moved in at the time in a neighborhood right off of OBT. And what she found was that there was this cycling in and out of women on and off the street corners and in and out of the jails that were caught in exploitation. She wasn't even calling it human trafficking. And she felt, as a Christian, that we were missing a whole invisible group of women in our community that were not being received, did not have support, and didn't really have any places to turn. And so she, at the time, went to her home church, which was Summit Church, and basically said, hey, as Christians, we are called to meet the lost, right? To bring out people that are oppressed. We are meant to be light in dark places. And yet the church has pulled back from that, and they're sitting in darkness. And how can we be a light? And so the church really came alongside her to support her. At Samaritan Village, that is the foundation of what we do, which is to bring Christ to these women. The name that we have, Samaritan Village, is out of the story in John 4, when Jesus meets the woman at the well. And so often when we hear that story, you hear of the lady who comes to the well and Jesus says, you have 5 husbands and the man you're with now is not even your husband. And we read that story and we go, oh gosh, what a woman, right? What kind of woman was she that she had 5 husbands? And we negate the fact that she really was a product of her environment, right? She was a product and a victim of a system that did not protect her, of men that had discarded her and passed her on to the next. And Jesus, as she comes to this well thirsty for something very physical, Jesus looked at her and said, I see your spiritual thirst, and I'm here to, I can fill that, right? And he saw beyond all of the circumstances and all the things that we would go, she's to blame for that. She put herself in that situation. That's a series of bad decisions, right? And said, no, you're a victim, and I see that, but I'm here to give you life. And so that's really the root of our story. And that is what we see with the women. And so, people will ask us, so who are you in that story? Like, we're not Jesus. We're just the well. We're the place where the woman who is thirsty, who needs living water, comes to meet her Savior.
That's good.
So we look at the prophet Isaiah, who said that the coming Messiah would come. The coming Messiah would come to set the prisoners free. And Matthew 25, that when you do it unto the least of them, you've done it unto me. And so we feel compelled as a church body that we are going to be engaged with the least and the lost. And we do that in a variety of ways. It's interesting. We are what I would call kind of on the periphery of this. Tomas, they're boots on the ground. They're the ones who are interacting with law enforcement, meeting with the women who are being rescued, finding out where they're going to be housed. What the faith-based community can do, and what First Pres is doing, is what can we do to support and augment and facilitate the work that they're doing. So we look at things like advocacy. And I think that Dee would tell you, and First Pres got very involved with Samaritan Village, and we've been involved with Florida Abolitionists almost from the get-go. But whenever either of those organizations has a need, we're the first to go to say yes. And we will jump in at anything that they need with either human capital or financial capital. So when the disciples get sent out by Jesus in Mark 6, they get sent out 2 by 2. And when he sends them out, you may recall, he says, don't take anything with you. Don't even take an extra tunic. Mm-hmm. And so why did he do that? Well, at least one of the reasons was so that the surrounding Christian community would go, wow, if they're going to actually do this, we're going to have to support them. We're going to have to feed them. We're going to have to help them get clothes when they need it. We're going to have to surround them with financial resources and the things that they will need. And so that's how we see the role of the church in terms of advocacy, financial contribution, and then love and service. We have tried when possible to serve at Ruth's house, which is one of the properties at Samaritan Village. So we've done yard work there. We've done Christmas decorations. I remember sitting working with one of the residents in a flower bed and having conversations and just building relationships so that they know, as Genesis 1:27 reminds us, that they are the pinnacle of God's creation, that they are the imago Dei, that they've been stamped with the image of God, and that they are beloved by their creator. And I think that is often something that is lost. So opportunities to love and serve are also things that I think the church is uniquely gifted and called to do. And then we pray a lot, and we have active prayer teams and people who are praying about the work, and the women who are engaged in this, and not only for their recovery, but for those who need to be rescued. And I think one of the biggest things that we have tried to champion all along is, and I've spoken at the banquets and the different forums, it's appalling. And I think if my numbers are right, last year there were 400 and some odd calls for help. We only had the capacity to help 100 women, and there are only 10 beds. I think that's right. Roughly 10 beds in Central Florida. So what we need is space. What we need is houses. We need beds. We need and we need the financial means to provide that. And so I think those are the things that we can advocate and champion. And we just need more resources and we need more space. And so I think that's what our church has tried to do, is to try to be one of those surrounding partners that can help supply what these organizations need.
That's good. And you bring up a very interesting point. And I point this out. When I do my training and I talk to clergy or I talk to parishioners or I just talk to constituents or people in the community, I let folks know that everybody has a different task. You have your order in ministry, you have your fivefold ministry, then you have your ministry of helps where people come in. And I let some churches know, listen, the best thing that you can do is just be prayer warriors, be intercessors. Everybody has a different role. And I love that about how things are coming together, because not everybody's trying to do the same thing. The ministry that's in me in terms of helping people began in me before I started my church. I've always had a need for helping. My father was an attorney for the NAACP, the civil rights, doing busing back in Michigan and fought desegregation. And he also worked at the Justice Department in DC. And then I've got an aunt that started a drug crisis center. And we've always been helping people. So that was in me. And when I came to the ministry, being somewhat different, I looked at how can we affect what's going on so that we make a conscientious change. Because I've talked to too many people who felt that churches turned them away, didn't understand, looked down to them. In India, you have a caste system where you have those that are on top, and then you have the untouchables down there. And for years, we've looked at, folks of low socioeconomic status, minorities, others as being on the bottom. And so when you have throwaways like women who are caught in prostitution, because that's what we called them years ago, they were just prostitutes, they were hoes. We didn't look at it as these are people, these are individuals. And so from the beginning, what our ministry has tried to do, starting with domestic violence, is just to reach out and to be there, to be that listening eye, to not browbeat them with, our gospel, but to show the love that we said that our gospel stands for, to just be there in love and to show them that we can love them. And then through the years, I had more people that I just had them pray and intercede, because I found that to be most effective, that if you have folks that feel uncomfortable in dealing directly with a trafficking victim, then you don't put them in that position. You don't put them there to possibly cause more harm than good. So I went out and I would take my advanced teams, and then closely working with Thomas, the whole aspect of training. This whole idea of human trafficking has taken off, just like many of you don't know, but 25 years ago, domestic violence was like this. Something happened at home, a cop would come, hey, bud, just go walk around the corner and come back. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't taken out of the home. She was, and today there's still some signs of that, where nothing is done. And a lot of law enforcement throughout the United States still have that old boy's attitude where they didn't. So if you imagine that with domestic violence, what do you think about human trafficking, where we always thought it was a third world issue? And so my biggest focus with our ministry, and I've taken from having a concrete church to now where I've closed it, and I've taken total evangelism with No Limit Ministries, because God said, take it outside of the perimeters and go, because there's a number of churches that want to do the right thing, but they don't know how. There's a number of corporations that don't understand it. So taking the fact that, my vast degrees in working in different public sector and private sector is to go in and really opening the door and the awareness of folks so that they truly understand, number one, what is human trafficking? What is the nature of it? And number two, how do we address it individually? Because when you're out there, you can't come and these women have been institutionalized and indoctrinated with, we're the bad guys, the pimp and daddy, he's the man, and they better not say anything. So when we come with this idea, hey, I want to pull you out of trafficking, they're looking at us and say, you don't understand. This is my life. You can get me killed. You got your Bible and talk this. Plus, if you can't answer the question, where was God when they were being raped? What do you tell them? What do you tell them with the sovereign, loving God? And most people are like deer in the headlights. And you have to tell them he's still God. He was always there. It's the nature of the sin that takes place in our nation. So we've really focused in trying to take United Abolitionists now to the point where we can really open up people's eyes and let them know this is the real issue. And this is what we need you to do, whether it's $1, whether it's a prayer, whether it's an invitation to the Samaritan village, whether, like Pastor said, there's no housing for them. If they're under 18, DCF takes them in, and then they're ultimately put in some type of foster care. Well, look what happens there. The shelters that we don't have, domestic violence shelters, are supposed to be the place that you send these women. But when they go there, they're a different type of victim. And most of them run and leave because they don't understand. And then the staff at the shelters don't understand how to deal with a trafficking victim. So we need to build places where we can take them and help them. And one of the key things that they told me, that many of them told me over the years, is the reason why we don't talk to like law enforcement or prosecuting attorneys is because when all they want to do is get the case. They want a case. They want the trafficker. They don't think about us. We're just a means to lock up the trafficker. What we've had to tell them is, listen, I will be with you until you don't need me anymore. Here's my email. Here's my number. And give them an opportunity to say, I'll always be with you, because you're going to deal with recidivism. They're going to think about going back. They're going to have issues. But we have to be in a position where we can say, we're going to be there. And the difference is, when you have the love of Christ, it's different from the world just simply saying, we're here. Because we know how the world will turn its back. But as Christians, as people of God, he's told us to go on the highways and byways. We're supposed to be there at all times.
Very good. There was a statement that was made earlier. I can't remember which panelist made the statement about how the church has basically been set in the midst of darkness. And of course, we're the light of the world. We're supposed to shine in the midst of that darkness and reach and make impact. However, as a clergy and as a pastor myself, you can only imagine how much responsibility the church already has. As you heard Dr. Swanson say, we're already dealing with homelessness. We're dealing with youth empowerment, domestic violence crisis, and so on. The question now we pose is, as a person of faith, why is it important to care about the fight against human trafficking? Amongst all of the other things we're managing, why is it important to care about the fight against human trafficking? We'll start with Dr. Swanson. We'll go back to you, Dr. Davis, and then we'll end with you.
I think it's all, for me, why should we care? Why should we be involved? It all, for me, goes back to Genesis 1:27, that we have been created in the image of God. There's a little document in this country that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, and yet that really isn't the practice of our society, that we look at people, this is not India, but we still look at some as being higher or better than others. And so that impacts a number of different issues. But I think if we truly, you can't believe in Genesis 1:27 and not care about people who bear the sacred emblem of God. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're people of faith. That just means that they proceeded from the hand of the creator and the sustainer of the universe, that they bear what is sacred in their being, and they reflect something of the image of God to the world as men and women, and that we then are to see them that way. And clearly, this is a group of people in our society and in our culture who are not being viewed that way, and who have lost. So Genesis 1:27 ought to change how we see ourselves, and ought to change how we see one another, because there are three things about the uniqueness of our creation. We've been created to have the capacity to be in relationship with God. We have the capacity to be in relationship with one another, and the capacity to be in relationship with the rest of his creation. And so as we are engaging all three of those things, then we bear a responsibility. As I said earlier, when we see how sin mucks all that up, then we have a responsibility to move and to care for and help restore how they see themselves, not as broken, not as mistakes, not as victims of fate or chance, but actually there is a loving God who describes them as that one who is radiant and without wrinkle or stain or blemish. And our task as the church is to find these women and to lift them up with that sense of themselves. And that's what we would endeavor and work to do. And I don't think you can see it any other way if you understand Genesis 1:27.
For me, I'm the type of pastor that I watch certain things on TV and tears come to my eyes. I'm like, God, what's wrong with you? Why I got to cry over everything? And he has constantly reminded me, son, because you have my heart. And when you think about those that don't have, it's easy to say that's not my problem. It's easy to say they aren't my problem. But if you have the heart of God and you're truly saved, and you think about the lost sheep, or you think about the lost coin, or you think about the prodigal son, whatever scripture you want to find from there, the least of God's. If you look at what God has done, he's always gone for the one that was forgotten. And you know what? I wasn't birthed by a man. I was birthed by a woman. And women are more precious to God. From a man, he formed a woman. And he's asked us to just take care of all his people. And so for me, the church or anybody of faith cannot overlook those that are least trodden. Now, I will grant you this. It may not be in your particular area to firsthand work with trafficking or homeless victims, but work with somebody that doesn't have. That happens to be my calling, to deal with women and women's issues. And I feel girded for that. But there are those that may not be. But I find it in my heart to make sure that, not only do I love them, but I love them with the love of Christ. And as you are alluding to it with Genesis 1:27, when you think about Peter, when Peter talked, we said, God is love. So just think about that. If God is love, then everything that God has done is done in love. And what is love other than patient and kind, not envious nor jealous? We know these things, but oftentimes we can recite them, we can read them, but can we live them? If you look at the state of our nation today, everybody's up in arms. And watch this, with all the chaos that's going on, these women are still being overlooked. So although things happen, the things that Satan is trying to do to destroy this world are still going on. And that's why we must continue to build soldiers of people who have the love of God, whether you donate through your dollar or your manpower or your prayer or something. Ensure that we're finding and looking out and loving God's laws. And may I remind also, we talk about trafficking, we always allude to the female, but they're young boys, young girls, and men and women. The difference between a child and an adult is force, fraud, or coercion. But if you pick someone off the street and she's 21, she's an adult. But guess when she got started? She was a baby. She was a child. Why do we now look at her as a prostitute? She's still a victim. We have to change the mentality of society. But until they catch up with us, the people of God, we need to do what we need to do.
I echo all of those comments. One of the things that I was thinking about when you asked that question was, as a Christian, having a Christ-centered worldview, what does that mean in terms of the work that we do? And my mind always goes back to the Lord's Prayer, where he says, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. As a Christian, I feel it is my duty to operate in kingdom work, right? And as Dr. Swanson said in the beginning, restoration is to restore the right order of things. If I'm operating in the kingdom of God, if he has called me to be a part of his kingdom, then it is my duty, or I feel it is my personal duty, then to do my best to restore that right order in as best as ways I can do that. And what is that right order when we talk about survivors of trafficking, right? That is seeing them through the eyes of Christ, and their dignity, their worth, their value, knowing that they too have a purpose here on this earth. So that's one of the things that how I would answer that. The other thought that came into my head when you asked that question was similar to what you were talking about. Not all of us are called to go out there and, what I always kind of say is bust down the doors of these trap houses or work hand in hand through a survivor's restoration process. It's not easy work, right? He calls us to so many different things. And when I look at what human trafficking entails, there's a lot of people that are turned off by it. And I go, if you could just understand that human trafficking is one of the few injustices that touches on almost every other aspect of our community. When we talk about affordable housing, it affects survivors, right? That's a component that gets women in vulnerable situations. When we talk about the opioid crisis, when we talk about homelessness. So if you are not specifically saying, I'm not really pulled by this issue, or maybe I even still have questions, I still see that it feels like still a choice that these women are making. We have to look at our totality of our community and say, God might be calling me to the mental health aspect, and I can also serve survivors and realize that that affects the nature of this issue. So I just think that God calls us to go where he leads, right? And that can lead us in a lot of different directions. And unfortunately, and fortunately, it kind of, you can see how all of those different branches funnel right down into this issue that we're talking about today.
And I guess a follow-up to what you all have just responded to. I'm just thinking like pastors on various levels. They may be watching now and say, "Oh, Dr. Swanson has a church with so many resources. We don't compare to that. We can't compete with First Prayers in meeting the needs of in the human trafficking." So, can you all respond to, I guess, ministries on different levels, at different sizes, of exactly, just give them ideas of what they can do to engage in this movement? Dr. Swanson, we'll start with you. Dr. Davis.
I think one of the most important things to do is as we learned in trying to serve various communities, the white church is really great at going in and doing what we think is best for a community, and we oftentimes don't pause to ask. And so I would say, no matter what faith community you're part of, the first thing you need to do is talk to people like these individuals and others who lead organizations and say, what do you need and how can we help? And then you go get on your knees and you pray about how God would provide through you to be in those situations. And I think if you ask, God has a funny way of answering and showing you. And I think that's the most important thing. And obviously it matters not size or amount. What matters is engagement, that you are participating and a part of being the solution, and you're being faithful to God's call where you are. And so we're trying to do that. And I would encourage, every faith community can make their people aware of this and to have eyes to see it in ways that we haven't before.
So I think as an organization that partners with many churches and people in the faith community, it can be easy to listen to panels and to kind of absorb all this material and watch the movies like Taken and all the things that attract us to this issue. But then at the end of the day, we don't take action, right? We become so overwhelmed by this issue. And so my encouragement to anybody watching and listening is to do exactly what Dr. Swanson said, which is to reach out to, there's so many different agencies here in Central Florida doing incredible work surrounding this issue. And it's, what do you have in your toolbox, right? So often we have people that come to us and say, what do you need? That's a tremendous question. And our next question is then, what do you have, right? What are you able to do? Some churches that partner with us don't have the financial means to give to us, but they are right there pushing their congregation to become tutors and mentors to survivors. And so there are a number of ways that you can plug in with Samaritan Village particularly, but again, so many incredible organizations that do such great work. So,
it's plain and simple. When I started my storefront, I just led by God. I probably did everything wrong, and I know that I did now. That's why I try to talk to young pastors that I did everything wrong. I put a second on my house to finance the church and did everything that I thought God wanted me to do. And God said, I never said that. But one thing that I did do that he did ordain is, if I had questions I asked. When I had the issue of domestic violence, I went and talked to Carol Wick, who was just taking over the Harbor House. And I said, what's going on? And then I sat down and I took classes and I learned. I found out how to called the county, said, how can I get in the jail and talk to the young inmates that are inside there? I went to the streets. I went down on OBT where they said things, you get out there. I don't have the resource. Our ministry never had the resources like a First Pres had, but we have different callings. And the main thing I would say is, whatever you do, get outside the four walls. Too many churches are trying to build mega churches within their own walls, as opposed to doing God's work and letting it happen naturally and through time. People will see you, pastors are trying to have this and have that. You got to train your people to be aware of what they can do. Who can you affect in your neighborhood? Who can you affect in your school? Who can you affect in your community? Who can you affect outside the doors of your church? And find out what you can do. You don't have to be any other church. And if God called you, he will sustain you for that. And if not, get out and then go join somewhere else and be a part of the ministry of helps.
Just an example I thought of, when we first started working with the women at Ruth's house, we had someone in our church who was a fitness trainer. You know, by no means was she well fixed income wise, but she said, you know what would be awesome is if we got these women who, if you're physically in bad condition, you're just not going to feel good about yourself. Let's train to run a 5K. Or maybe walk a 5K. And so she bought them all running shoes and trained them. And the 5 of them ran a 5K together. And it was like this huge victory, this huge triumph. And it was just something simple as someone saying, well, what do I have? Well, I'm a fitness trainer. All right. How could I offer that? And she did. And it was this amazing experience. So that's a good example of what we're talking about.
It's amazing you say that because my wife and I are Zumba instructors.
See, there you go.
And if somebody had told me 10 years ago that I was going to be doing doing Latin dances and preaching at the same time, they'd been like, no, you don't do it. But it was a way to minister and to talk to people and provide a way for them to come and to take care of my body too. So.
And I think that's good because this pandemic, while everybody is looking at the tempestuous, tragic nature of it, they don't see the triumphant victory that God has given us in all of this. And why I say that is, while the church's doors per se, buildings have been closed, the church is still open. Mm-hmm. Simply because God has provided and almost forced his church to be relevant. Mm-hmm. Because prior to this pandemic, many of us, just what you say, are building mega churches and more focused on internal budgets, internal needs, and forgetting the external ministries that we have around us. And I often question, I've trained some pastors tomorrow on my way to a conference now. And often I ask pastors, if your church burned down today, if for some reason, some tragedy removed it from the block, who would miss it? Would anybody come looking and say, where's your church? Where's that pastor? Are you making such a relevant impact that even without the building there, they're still looking for the people? Mm-hmm. And I believe that this pandemic has given such an opportunity for the faith-based entity altogether, whether it be church or organization, what have you, to be relevant and to actually do more than preach and to do more than talk and do more than just spew out our religious rhetoric, but to be the hands and the feet and the heart of the God that we say we represent. And with that being said, that leads us to this final question. This final question is going to give all you ministers over there an opportunity. I want you to act now like you're coming to the end of your sermon. And now it is time to bring the recap and the conclusion and the summary that now leads them to make a decision. Them to make that decision to respond favorably to the message that you've ministered. And this question says, for those listening, watching today, how would you encourage them to get involved? After they've heard everything that we shared today, now it's time to enlist. It's time to get people to sign up and to get engaged. So we'll first start with you, Dr. Davis, and then we'll go to you, D, and then we'll end with Dr. Swanson.
Well, if I was wrapping up and after the crescendo and bringing it to a head and about to make this altar call, I'd say the same thing that I say in the beginning. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. God has called us for work, and it's unconscionable for me to think that I could sit back and not do anything. I had to close the doors of my church because I thought I was going to die in the pulpit, but I had to realize that God said, no, I didn't really place you in there forever. I placed you to move you now into an evangelistic apostolic role to deal with this issue of trafficking on a global scale. But it took a lot to do that because I just knew I had to stay there because I thought that was my place. But our place is wherever God wants us to be and doing the things that he wants us to do. I've always led, and I end with this adage, if you can affect and touch one life, that one life can affect thousands. It takes one chemical to cause a chain reaction. If we can just get one person out there to listen and to say, you know what, I'm going to talk to a young lady. I'm going to talk to a young man. I'm going to talk to my brother or my sister or somebody. It may be somebody before they get into trafficking, because one of the big issues now is so many people with social media are being lured in every day. And if you can stop your young niece or your young cousin from getting caught up in this thing, you're doing something. But the bottom line is do something, please.
Well, I'm not a minister, so I don't have a closing remark other than, our safe house for the last, almost 8 years, and we've been around for 11, was only able to serve 4 to 6 women at a time. And I've often been asked, only 6 women, so much work that you guys do and so much that you pour into these women, is it really even worth it? And I've looked back at people and I go, if that was your daughter that made it into our house after living through unimaginable trauma, would it be worth it to you? And I actually had a pastor come to our safe house and he toured it with his wife, and we sat down on the couch and he actually began to share about his history and how his parents had been parents that were caught in addiction and a lot of abuse. And he said, in my learning and growing, I realized that it takes 3 generational cycles to break free completely of trauma and abuse and addiction. And he goes, what you are doing for these women is legacy building. You guys are changing the trajectory of an entire generation through the life of one woman. So as we serve one woman in that house, her kids will begin to heal from the things that they've had to witness, and her grandkids will never know her to have been that person. And their kids will go on. And that is the work that we do. And so if you're compelled by any of the talks that you've seen over the last 2 days, over anything that we've said here today, understand that now is the time to make action so that the next generation no longer has to suffer.
Amen.
And I would just,
preacher, huh?
yeah, she can preach. I would just remind you that the gospel message is like breathing. You inhale and you exhale. And if you don't do both, you're doing it wrong. Mark 3, Jesus called the disciples and he says, I called you that you might be with me, that I might send you out. And there are way too many churches that get the first part and they forget the second. The gospel has 2 parts to it. You come in so that you're fed, you're loved, you're nourished, you're encouraged. You know who you are in the eyes of God. And then he sends you out so that you might exhale the goodness and the hope and the promise of the gospel upon a dark and a weary world right now. And so I would encourage you to be sure to remember to do both parts. You come in, you go out. You be loved, you go love the city. You know truth, you go live truth. And that's our calling as Christian men and women.
Amen.
And I think another thing to add with everything that has been said is something that's so familiar to us, and that's the serenity prayer. God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, to change the things that we can, and give us the wisdom to know the difference. And that's exactly what we have to do around this issue of human trafficking. Ask God for that serenity to accept what we cannot. There's some things that we can't do. There's no matter how we feel about it, we can't do anything to correct it. But then there are some things that we can do, and we heard them shared by these panelists today, how we can use our capacity, the resources, the heart that God has given us to heal and repair the breach for the victims. And I know while there's a justice part of it to get those who've been a part of this and have hurt people and arrest them, but then there are victims who are left to live with the pain of what have happened with them, and they need to be surrounded by a community of love, a community of hope, and a community of support. So it's our prayer that God grant us the serenity to accept what we can change, cannot change, to change the things that we can, and that he gives us the wisdom to identify and know the difference. With that being said, it leads us into a period of question and answering. I think that questions and answers will come on the screen. And you have a question? Stand, please.
Thank you for what you all have to say. I think it was very insightful and helpful, and I definitely think that the community is missing in what we're dealing with these days. I'm curious, do you think that our faith, rather than preventing more violence, actually contributes to an environment where ways we can raise our children to think that it is acceptable to be those who are different rather than those that also we do? Do you think it's possible for us to be able to
I couldn't hear the whole question. I know it's hard with your mask on. Could you? Yeah.
do you think that our faith, rather than preventing more violence, actually contributes to an environment where we raise our children to make it acceptable to hate those who are different, those who don't believe
suppose there might be, the church is filled with sinful, broken people. And I've heard it said, the church would be a great place if it wasn't for all the people. And we are a broken lot, but I don't know of any church that I would consider to be one that is following the dictates and the commands of Scripture that would raise anybody and teach anyone to be about the task of hatred. I think that would be in opposition to Jesus's command, as Dr. Davis said earlier, that a new command I give you, as I have loved you, you love one another. Now, there are certain things that we agree in Christianity. There are doctrines and beliefs, as any religious tradition would have, that we stand on and believe to be true. But that doesn't mean if you bear the image of God, then all people, regardless of what you believe, possess worth and value. And because of that worth, are inherently called by God to be treated with love and respect and dignity. I don't care who you are, where you come from, or what you believe. And so that's the lens by which we see all people. And I think that we've been sold in this culture a false narrative that says today that if we disagree on something, that automatically the walls go up and we cancel each other. We got to get over that narrative so that we can actually disagree on things and yet still look at one another with that sense of reverence and love because of the image of God that's stamped upon both of us. So I would hope that that would never happen in our churches, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it doesn't. I think we've seen hatred plenty of times in this country, but we certainly want to move against that.
Unfortunately, just as the wheat and the tare exist, you're going to have certain folks that may teach a doctrine that leads one to be judgmental. I always just try to tell people you have to follow your heart and know the difference. What does the word say compared to what others have said? We live in a society and we're learning new things with all these social media and technology. Word gets out so quickly and things get misconstrued. And even texting. And sometimes my wife and I have to look, I had to ask her, what did you mean by this text? Because we hear a voice in the text and it's just words. We don't know how the person is talking and you can assume things. Everyone has to check their heart to make sure that their faith or their belief is in love and that it causes them not to judge others. We've got a crazy world that we live in. In this world, we've got people from all walks of faith and denominations. And what I tell Christians is, you may not agree with someone's philosophy or whatever, but learn to love. If you lean with love, then it will be all right. Does it exist? Yeah, but you try individually. I know Dr. Swanson and his folks and my folks, we do the best we can to teach love, and even Bishop, Cabarrus, the best we can, but we're only one individual, but hopefully that one again will make a bigger dent in society, but I understand what you're saying with all that's going on now. Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to wrap this up. We'd like to thank you, Dr. Swanson. Thank you, Dee, and thank you, Dr. Davis, for serving as panelists today. And thank you, audience, for being here, those virtually and those who are present with us. And I thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to moderate. And my final statement to you is to be the change that you want to see. And I encourage each of you to go and make a difference. God bless you.
You guys pause for 30 seconds because I'm going to acknowledge you, but I want to acknowledge the bishop. No, go sit over there so people can finally see you. So thank you, right, on behalf of Tomas Lars, of United Abolitionists, Paving the Way, UCF, and Valencia College. It takes a brave human being to step out on the skinny branches and talk about faith in an environment today, right, that calls for not that. And I acknowledge each and every one of you for being a yes to this, for starting the conversation. And I know that we can count on you as community leaders in the faith space to really go out and make a difference with not only your congregation, but to invite other congregations to have these challenging conversations. Because it's only when we shine the light on our differences that we actually get to see how much we are so alike that we are different. Thank you.